This presentation this morning is a presentation in the cycle which I've designated as an interval. And the reason for an interval is to make a punctuation. Just as in music, a note, in order to be itself, must emerge as a coherent, limited tone of sound. The progression of several notes in an order to make a set is maintained as a set because of an interval of higher order. So that intervals are not always the same. The interval between two notes in the same octave is distinctly different from the interval between two octaves. And when a whole scale is finished, the interval at the end of that scale is of a still different order. This means that intelligence has a sensitivity to it, which is able to appreciate that there are different silences. There are differences in space. And for initial convenience, we'll say that the differences are in terms of magnitude. Silence has magnitudes. This in itself is one of the more arcane discoveries of symbolic order. In experience, on the level of myth, men and women do not understand that there are differences to silences. What's important in experience is what is happening, what is going on, the action, the doing, the talk about the doing, the storyline. And all spaces are the same. So that in experience you have form and background. They constitute a polarity. If one put an ideation on it, they would constitute a duality. The idea of a polarity is a duality. Polarity as an idea is much advanced beyond the idea of a duality. The idea of a polarity belongs to science, whereas the idea of a duality belongs to what used to be called traditionally magic, but is based on symbol, and it's actually a function of vision. But in experience, there are no ideas. In experience, there are no ideas. Experience is the ongoingness. It's the living of life, its ongoingness. And the substrate for life is existence, the objectiveness of what we do, what has been done, what we are doing. And on the substrate of existence, experience puffs up like an atmosphere, like clouds. In fact, in Buddhist analysis, the term papancha is given to the ongoingness of life, to the effect of karma. Papancha, it means cloud gathering. An experience is like an atmosphere of cloud gathering. In this atmosphere, silences, intervals, do not have a distinct difference to them. The experience of one silence is the same as another. We are now coming to the study of symbols, the culmination of our first year. We began with nature, moved to ritual, have just finished with myth, and are looking forward next week to start with symbol. This is the third interval, the interval between myth and symbol. We've had 2 intervals so far. The first interval, if you remember, was at the end of nature, and we used the Tao Te Ching. The second interval, at the end of ritual, we used the Mundaka Upanishad. And now, at the end of myth, we're going to use Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus. The first interval with the Tao Te Ching was that the experience of space, the experience of interval, the experience of the silent background to everything is simply Tao. It's undifferentiated. You could call it the great unconscious. Some European mystics like Jakob Böhme called it the mysterium magnum. The universe, the great unknown. The space outside of the expanding universe, where all the galaxies and all the quasars cease to be, where all the great initial soup of radiation and matter cease to be, before the Big Bang. What was there was the highest order of silence, the largest space. And like any higher order, there's more intensity. So at the end of nature with the Tao, our sense of interval, our sense of space, our sense of silence was undifferentiated. But at the end of ritual, where we found the first objectivity, we had discovered that nature is not objective at all. There are no things in nature. There's only a constant, undifferentiated flow. It's a learned process for us to make objects out of nature. Nature qua nature. Nature by itself, in and of itself, is undifferentiated. There are no convenient lines. There's only a constant flow in a matrix of change. But we found in ritual the first objectivity, the first level where objectivity occurs. And the initial objectivity is not in things, but in actions, in what is done. That the first objectivity is in movement. That is objective, long beforehand. Things precipitate and have their objectivity out of the previous reality of movement. One can take the yoga of nuclear physics and can take any object and go down to its molecular structure, down to its atomic structure, down to its subatomic structure, and there is no end where there is something statically there. There is always movement, vibration, a shimmering. And it is that that is real. And out of the gestalts of the movement come the objectivity that we designate as things. And so ritual is an action, ritual is a doing, and ritual objects gain their existence out of their ritual actions. The mask of food comes out of your eating. The mask of feeling comes out of your feeling. The objectivity, the very basement, the very rock foundation upon which things are said to exist, is what they do. And from what they do, we get an image precipitating, and the image pictures for us what they are. Not what they are in a static referent, but what they are in their doingness. And at the end of ritual, for an interval, we use the Mundaka Upanishad. Mundaka from the Sanskrit term for taking a razor to shave away. Mund. When you shave away everything that is secondary, everything that is extraneous, you come to the very core of it. And in the Mundaka Upanishad, one comes to the very core, that nothing exists until there is a doing. And when one is completely absorbed, as in a yoga, of doing the shaving of the extraneous, what is left at that yoga is nothing whatsoever except the act of shaving away. And so the discipline that was there in the interval at the end of ritual was that when one is mindful on the deepest level, what we do is the substrate of existence, is the basis upon which the real exists as an objectivity. And we saw that because doing is the basis of objectivity, is the basis of the real, because doing is that basis, language is a talking about what we're doing. And in the language, in the flow of talk, words, images precipitate out just as things precipitated out of the movement of doing. So that the images, the words in a language, base themselves upon the things that precipitate out of existence. But language itself is an ongoing phenomenon, is a talking which follows the substrate of the doing. So in a way, when one is really fine about this, with the interval at the end of myth, when we come to the interval that brings myth to a closure for us, with the Sonnets to Orpheus by Rilke, we face an experience of a work which is attentive to the fact that on a sea of change, there is a sheen of doing And there's an atmosphere of saying about this sheen on this change movement. And that something happens when you have these three motions together. When you have the change of nature and the sheen of ritual action and the movement of the clouds of language, and they are seen together, those three movements together form, they knit, they interpenetrate, they become a fabric which is actually a membrane. And this membrane of the three together allows us to constellate an inner world at the same time as recognizing, in retrospect, an outer world for the first time. And the simple way that this is done, the very simple way that this is done, is that we begin to have an inclination to observe our experience, not to be caught up in the experience all the time, but to begin to be a witness to that experience. We begin to note that we are doing this, that we are reaching for a cup, we are taking a sip of coffee, we're putting the cup down, we've listened to a fire engine go by, someone is speaking, making gestures, beginning to get ready to talk about one of the great poetic productions of the 20th century, about a man who considered himself an angelic messenger from the beyond future to bring to man a new testament, a newer testament, a gospel of love that allows us to penetrate through the membrane separating life from death. That very membrane is initially made by ritual action. We ourselves made the first contact point on that membrane when we brought the two masks that we made together, the mask of food and the mask of feeling. The mask of food as an image of what comes from without and goes within, becomes a part of us. The mask of feeling of what comes out from us and goes out and expresses the inner and the outer world. The outer coming in, the inner going out. And that when these two masks are brought in proximity, when they're brought together, they don't quite meet. They can be in contact physically together, but ritually there is between them a space, no matter how thin, a film, no matter how thin. But the film is only disclosed by that single point of contact between the two masks. That point between the two masks is the first objective point on this membrane. And it is this membrane that will separate the outer world from the inner world. And as Rilke will observe, if the membrane is made into a wall, the inner world will suffocate because it will have no nourishment from the outer world. And the outer world will wither because it will have no nourishment from the inner world. Because in nature, the inner and outer are undifferentiated. They nourish each other all the time. There's no inner, no outer. And existence is just an appearance of things. Still, there is just the action and the doing. No difference between inner and outer. And in language also, there's no difference between inner and outer as long as one is immersed in experience and just doing. If you find yourself just doing something, you're completely absorbed in the doing of it. It doesn't occur to you that there's any difference. But as soon as we begin to witness what we're doing, we pay attention to what we're saying or what we're doing. A kind of a self-consciousness comes into play. There is the first opportunity. There is the first flaw. There is like an original sin possibility of making a wall there, of identifying this is my interior and that exterior is up for grabs, and I better get as much of it as I can get. And I better learn how to do things so I can get more. This wall makes an ego. On the ritual level, there are no egos. On the mythic horizon, there are no egos. Primordial mankind did not have this problem, the problem of the egotistic, the problem of the selfish. When an interiorization of language first began to occur, and that membrane was opaqued to a wall, that's the beginning of the ego. That's the beginning of a selfishness. That's a beginning of a mine. This is mine. And the projective assumption that you are totally different from me. And you have something that's mine, and I want it. And I want it now. How dare you to have taken what's mine? This is a language of an isolation that deepens because the intensity of the ego only deepens to alienation. It can only be more of what it is initially. And the seed of selfishness becomes the flower of brutality. And the very odor of violence has its seed there. This is where it is. And so, in a traditional wisdom tradition, that's not a redundancy, in a traditional wisdom tradition, at this particular point, where symbols are first talked about, there is usually an initiation. Our initiation is going to be to consider Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus. And if you find that you're not able to understand, not able to appreciate the next 3 months of symbols, if you find yourself not in tune with what is going on, go back to Rilke, go back to the Sonnets to Orpheus, go back to your initiation. Reinitiate yourself. This cassette will be available. You can get a copy, you can play it for yourself. It'll be there. So the purpose of material that occurs every 12 weeks, the interval material, and this is the third, the first, the Tao Te Ching, the second, the Mundaka Upanishad, the third, Sonnets to Orpheus. The purpose of these intervals is to give us a space, a silence, but a deepening silence. And whereas the silence of the Tao Te Ching was the silence of the Tao, undifferentiated, the silence of the Mundaka Upanishad was more intense. It was the silence that when you cut away the superfluous, you find ultimately no thing, but you find only your action of cutting away. So in the Sonnets to Orpheus, Rilke will find that at a more intense interval in silence, he will find that the only osmosis that there is between life and death is love. That life cannot go into death, and death does not interface with life, and without the membrane of love, they would be mutually exclusive and become a duality which would characterize a dead universe. Death would be death, and unnourished by life would be truly dead. And life without death would wither away. Now it's incredible that someone like Rilke could exist. It's almost beyond human possibility that someone like a Rilke could exist. One of the greatest poets of all time. But he was squeezed by two additional constraints upon his poetic genius. The first constraint was to develop a poetic genius in the first place. In the 20th century, which is the junkyard of poetic environments, it's very difficult. But Rilke in 1912 found that his deepest inside, his poetic inspiration had dried up. He could not write any further. He took his pen to write and nothing came out. And it astonished him because he had set himself to one of the greatest tasks of his whole life at that time, 1912. He had gone to a castle on the Adriatic Sea, high above the Adriatic Sea, on a huge bluff, in a castle called the Duino Castle. And in Duino Castle, he'd begun writing a series of poems about the nature of death called elegies. And he'd written 2 of the most beautiful elegies, and he was planning to write 10, and he wrote 2, and he could not write any further. And slowly, as the months went on, Rilke, being a very sensitive individual, being, as he said, an angelic messenger, began to realize that something terrible was wrong with the world and that he had picked up on it. And when World War I broke out, he realized that that's what it was. Because at the breakout of World War I, most of the very sensitive, highly sensitive psyches, especially in Germany, because that's where the violence, the brutality of World War I found its trigger. Those sensitive psyches whose mind was structured by the German language, they broke down. Literally, Carl Jung, who was one of the most gifted psychiatrists that the world has ever seen, suffered a mental breakdown. He couldn't practice for 5 years. It was only towards the end of that period that he kept the Red Book, a diary of his own complete mental breakdown. Hermann Hesse was one of the great novelists of the world, had written many fantastic novels by that time, couldn't write anymore. He put a rucksack on his back and started walking the Alps in Switzerland, made a pilgrimage to India to try to find out what is wrong with me. Rilke, the most sensitive human being in the German language, could not write for 9 years. He couldn't write a poem for 9 years. And finally, in late 1921, one of his friends, and most of his friends were elegant, noble women who owned chateaus and castles and would loan these places to him. A Chateau Museau was loaned to Rilke, and he took himself there to begin again with the Duino Elegies, and he found that he was able to begin to write. And as he began to write, the poetic language came back, And a great wind of inspiration began blowing through him, and just at that time he got a letter from one of his dearest friends, a woman whose daughter was only 19 years old, had died of a tragic illness. When she was a little girl, Rilke had watched her dance, and she was going to be one of the great ballerinas of Europe. But she contracted a glandular disease that slowly puffed up her joints and her body and swelled her into a monstrosity. And when she could no longer dance, she devoted herself to music. And when she could no longer even move to music, she would make beautiful sketches. And finally, she was frozen in a monstrous fat and died at 19. And the letter carrying this grief came to Rilke. And in the midst of writing the Duino elegies, after 9 years of not being able to write, he set the elegies down on the night of February 2nd, 1922. And he was seized by a fierce torrential spirit and wrote in 3 weeks all 55 sonnets to Orpheus, one of the great monumental works in world language. He, when he began, wrote this way: a tree stood up, O pure uprising. Orpheus is singing, O tall tree in the ear. And everything grew still. Yet in the silence there changes took place, signals and fresh beginnings. Creatures of stillness crowded from the clear, untangled woods, from nests and lairs, and it turned out that their light stepping came not from fear, nor from cunning, but so they could listen. Shriek, bellow, and roar had shrunk in their hearts, and while before there was scarcely a hut where they might stay, just a shelter made of the darkest cravings, with shaky posts for an entranceway, you made a temple of their hearing and their ears. Let's take a break. When Rilke was finished writing sonnets to Orpheus, he was himself astounded. And he wrote this. This is an excerpt from what he wrote about it, about the poems. He said, "Their rising up and imposing themselves on me was most mysterious, the most enigmatic dictation I have ever endured and performed." Notice here that the creative poet is not talking about his writing these poems, but about enduring this fierce, imposed dictation. As if the words were like an electric avalanche, that his sensitive neural fiber had to deal with this fantastic energy or be electrocuted. He wrote, the only way that he could do it was in a single, breathless obedience. He had to open up himself as an undifferentiated acceptance to even endure what happened to him. He wrote that when he finished, he didn't change a single word. It was very peculiar. One of the novels we're going to use at the beginning of Symbols, Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, Faulkner wrote As I Lay Dying in 6 weeks and didn't change a word. Faulkner, who had wanted to be a writer, had gone to New Orleans from his Oxford, Mississippi home to hang out with the Bohemians in New Orleans, Sherwin Anderson's clique, and had gotten himself published because he wrote some fantastic potboilers. And then he didn't make much money from the books, and he ended back up at the University of Mississippi in Oxford. And the only job he could get was as a night grave shift janitor, shoveling coal into the boiler furnaces to keep the university warm enough for the next day. And he wrote As I Lay Dying in 6 weeks of nights at the University of Mississippi in the basement of the boiler room and never changed a word. He wouldn't let anyone touch it because there was something sacred about it. It had come to him. The same with Rilke. It had come to him. The great science fiction writer Ray Bradbury told my now deceased friend Theodore Sturgeon that when he would sometimes be seized by the idea of a story, and he said that the experience was almost like some animal that would grab the back of his neck and not let go until he had gone to the typewriter and finished the story. That there are sensitivities in us that we are sometimes seized. It's like spiritual presences come there and need to talk through us. I always get a kick out of the channelers who are so glib. If they knew what being a sibyl was for the god, they would cringe in horror because it's never nice. And once you've had that kind of experience, the only thing you really want to do is keep quiet about it. Rilke said, when it was over, what he felt, what he was completely filled with was reverence and infinite gratitude that his existence had been pure enough to withstand an experience like that. Your existence has to be pure enough because the impurities in existence are the beginnings of the walls. The thinking to yourself that things are important. I want these things. These are my things. Because it's the projection of things being important that are the bricks that make the wall at the closure of experience when it goes interior. And it's things that are the seeds of the ego. And when someone has a pure existence, it's that you didn't fall for that. That you realize that the action and the process of life is what's real in existence. And so your experience was an ongoing story for that. So when it came time to have an interior, you had a membrane that was capable of osmosis rather than a wall. And that your inner world was nourished by the processes of life. And so your inner world was alive. And when you discovered that the operative function of that membrane between inner and outer was love, then life and death were both permeable to each other. Because to an ego, a going within is a kind of a death. And the ego does not want to go within. It digs its heels in. It puts spurs on. It gets whips, clubs, guns, anything to intimidate you not to have an interior life, because that's an isolation that leads to alienation. And out of that comes, in the cloud papancha of this kind of fearful experience, comes the dislike for things interior. Oh, well, that's intellectual stuff. That'll get you into trouble. Those people think about things rather than doing them. And all these adages have this hidden substrate of fear with its corollary of violence, because violence can only be fed by fear. When you take the fear out of a situation, there's no violence. It's the very principle that Gandhi refined, satyagraha, truth-holding. And if only one human being holds truth in a situation, the violence gets shorted out. It can't continue. It's very mysterious because it looks to others who try to foment the violence. They themselves begin to see that it's just like episodic, sporadic skits. Little skits that they try to make work and they don't quite work, because all it takes is one satyagrahi to hold truth in a situation, and it can't occur. That's the spirit. And just as there are different degrees of silence, different degrees of interval, there are different degrees of satyagrahis who can bring truth-holding into larger and larger atmospheres. And there have been beings on our planet who could hold the whole planet in nonviolence through their being truthful to themselves. What we can draw out of this is something we're going to use for the next 3 months. Powerful statement that symbols emerge transcendent to the mythic horizon of experience. At least that's what it seems like when you come from the angle of experience into the interior world. It seems like symbols are transcendent to experience. But when you're in an inner world, from the perspective of symbols, you can see, looking back, that it was different from that, different in just the way that when you look at a photograph of something, you have to realize that the photograph was printed out from something that was just the reverse to it, the negative to it. And that symbols are like this. Instead of being transcendent to experience, they are the exact complement opposite to that. They are immanent to experience, immanent. Instead of going above the horizon, they go below the horizon. The horizon of experience, the mythic horizon. They sink into language rather than go above language. And the reason that symbols seem to be transcendent to language is that going within, that immanent integration, tends to go so far within that it comes back out. Very mysterious. It goes so far within that it comes back out. And that coming back out, we'll see next year, is what used to be called magic. We're going to use the term vision. It's the beginning of a whole different mode of consciousness, differentiation. No one can intend it to happen. It has to be a gift. It's bestowed. It's given. It's a gift. You can't will it to happen. It won't happen if you will it to happen. It's like trying to will the book to rise off the table. It's not going to happen. It can't happen. But in a differential consciousness, one can lift the reality of that book off the table into a visionary language and declaim it. You don't even have to touch the book. The book is Ovid's Metamorphosis. And Rilke used the vision of Orpheus out of Ovid. He used it, but in a poetic way he used it. He didn't consult it like a dictionary, but it was circulating in him. Because Ovid's myth of Orpheus had the right tone, the right temper of feeling to talk about the dead girl. Because Orpheus, the myth of Orpheus, is going into the underworld to bring back a dead love, to try to bring a dead love back, and the impossibility of doing that. That even if you're an Orpheus, and even if you can go into the netherworld, and you can find that dead love, and begin to bring her back out, you cannot do it. Because the very essence of love is a mutual recognition. And as soon as you look to see, and that looking to see is the very essence of the love, she is gone. She is gone forever. As Ovid says, Orpheus sneaks a glance out of his love for Eurydice. And as soon as he does, he sees her fading, and all he hears, one word, so light and distant as to almost never have been uttered, and the word was farewell. And because he is disconsolate, because he is seized with disconsolation, if I can say. Not that he is disconsolate, but he is himself desolation happening. His language comes out in the vibrant form, the vibratory shape, that vibrant form of his desolation being expressed. But rather than just experience being the fabric of the language of desolation, because he has gone into an interior, into an immanent within, he's come in contact with a symbol. And that symbol gives a shaping quality so that the language of desolation that comes out has a way of healing. Because the singing of desolation is distinctly different from desolation. To suffer the experience of desolation is crushing a broken heart. That's all that there is there. But the ability to sing of it transforms the desolation into the song of desolation, and that heals. It heals by the universal process of bringing a within, bridging into the without. And when that happens, the wall of the ego becomes translucent. It loses its opaque, oblique, isolating qualities. And in a mystical way, life is able to go into death through love without suffering an end. And as Ovid writes in his presentation of Orpheus then, when he suffers, his death. His death is not an end, but he is able to go into the netherworld, and there he joins Eurydice forever. And they are united again, because he brings a breath of life into the netherworld, which she didn't have a chance to do. And that breath that he brings is so universal and vast that they could breathe together with that forever. This was in Rilke. And so he writes in the Sonnets to Orpheus, almost a girl it was, and issued forth from this concordant joy of song and lyre, and clearly shining through her springtime veils, she made herself a bed inside my ear, and slept in me, and all things were her sleep. The trees I always marveled at, those feelable distances, the meadow felt, and every wondering that befell myself. She slept the world. You singing God, how did you so perfect her that she did not crave first to be awake? See, she arose and slept. Where is her death? Oh, will you yet invent this theme before your song consumes itself? Whither is she sinking out of me? A girl almost. And at the very end of the Sonnets to Orpheus, this has been transformed. The 29th poem of the second of the two sections of Sonnets to Orpheus reads this way. Silent friend of many distances, feel how your breath is enlarging space. Among the rafters of dark belfries, let you yourself ring. What praise on you will strengthen from such nourishment? Come and go with metamorphosis. What's your most painful experience? If what you drink's bitter, turn it to wine. In this huge night, become the magic of the crossways of your senses. Be what their strange encounter means. And if the earthly forgets you, say to the quiet earth, I flow. Speak to that rushing water, I am. And so you see that sometimes human beings come in larger sizes than demagogues or promotable pseudo-gurus. They actually become angelic presences. One of the great translators of Rilke, J.B. Leishman, had this to say after struggling for a long time with translating Rilke, many, many years, 10, 12, 15 volumes of his poetry, said, I can think of no artist who so completely dedicated himself, so completely subordinated himself to his art. I can think of no art of this stature which the artist seems so often and so greatly to transcend, no art that seems so humbly and yet so superbly to confess its limitations as though it were, after all, but the necessarily imperfect record of some tremendous spiritual adventure, which our present means of communication may hint at, but are not yet sufficiently developed to express. Again and again, I feel in reading him that we have come round the spiral to another dawn of consciousness. where language is in the making, and where myth and symbol must often supply the place of not yet thinkable thoughts. No other writer is so full of the future. No other gives us such thrilling intimations of that inheritance on whose threshold we are standing, and which our civilization may be about to enter if it does not perish through its own destructive forces. And so at the beginning of the second part of the two parts to Sonnets to Orpheus, J.B. Leishman translates Rilke in this way. Breathing, invisible poem, that great world space, at each inhalation exchanged for this human existence, counterweight of my rhythmical realization, single wavelet whose slowly gathering sea am I. You, of all possible seas, most frugal and lowly, space laid by. Of all these places in space, how many a one has been within me already? Many a wind seems like a sun. Do you know me, air, full of my dwelling places? You, the one-time smooth-skinned ronger and leaf of my phrases? Ovid speaks of Orpheus singing in a grove, a special grove, an archaic kind of mythic grove of oak trees. And that these oak trees are actually the transformed, transmuted bodies of women. The very women who killed him, who stoned him to death. Why was Orpheus killed? Who were these women who stoned him to death? Beat him with stones with their hands until he was a pulp, till he was dead. Because he so mourned the loss of Eurydice that he forswore ever being with another woman. He put a limitation on this sexual energy, so essential to life, so much a structure of experience, so much there as a reality in existence. He put a limiting form on it. And these women were devotees of Dionysus. They were Bacchae. And these Bacchae suspected that Orpheus was against life. He's a world hater. He is a limiter of women. He is deserving of death from us because we are Bacchae. We are devotees of Dionysus, and they stoned him to death. They killed him on that basis. But when he was dead, Dionysus, the god, reprehended the women that Orpheus was a friend of life. Rather than being a limiting condition, he was like a lens that magnified the value of love, of sexuality, of interpenetration, of birth. He was a lens that raised it to a higher order. He magnified it. It was not an enemy. And so Dionysus put his energy on these women who had killed Orpheus. And the more that they realized what they had done, the more that their skin turned to bark, and they became the trees, the very grove in which Orpheus had sang. It's like time, space, and circumstance become convoluted in myth. And so when Orpheus sang, he sang in this forest, he sang in this grove of sacred oak trees. Because his singing of desolation transformed desolation into the song of desolation, which when it matures and deepens becomes a path of love. And that path of love becomes a bridge from life to death, linking them together indissolubly into an openness again. So that the universe of reality flows again with no walls. And Rilke writes it this way. This is the third of the first section of the Sonnets to Orpheus. A god can do it, but tell me how a man can follow him through the narrow, lyre. The human self is split. Where two heartways cross, there's no temple to Apollo. Song, as you teach it, is not desire, not a wooing of something that's finally attained. Song is existence. Easy for the god, but when do we exist? And when does he spend the earth and the stars on our being? When we love? That's what you think when you're young. Not so. Though your voice forces open your mouth, learn to forget how you sang. That fades. A real singing is a different kind of breath. A nothing breath. A ripple in the god. A wind. So that symbols, when they sink in, when they interiorize, they also transform. It's a distillation process, and what distills out of experience is essence. What distills, drop by drop, out of experience is essence. And it collects, that essence collects, and the collection takes place in forms that we still use the Greek word that Plato used, that he learned from Pythagoras, ideas. The idea is the crucible which accepts the distillation of experience into essence. So that the idea is not some dead, dull, intellectual thing that we should fear. It's the very essence of the interior reality. The idea of Orpheus changed the whole experience of the desolation, the death of this beautiful 19-year-old girl. Changed the experience of 10 years of silence because of the First World War. Became something different. Became possible, finally. So that Rilke, when he begins to sense this, writes about her at the end of the first section of Sonnets to Orpheus, the 25th part. But you now, whom I felt like a flower, I had no name for you, you taken away. Let me show you to them once. Let me remember lovely playmate, unconquerable cry, dancer first who suddenly, body filled without delay, stood still as if her youth were being cast in bronze, grieving and listening. Then from on high, agents, music fell into her changing heart. Sickness drew near, already possessed by shadows. Her blood rushed, darkening, yet as if running, scared. It surged toward its natural springtide, again and again, through falls and darkness interrupted. It glowed like the earth, until after hideous blows, it ran through a gate that was hopelessly wide. Rilke is seeing that the permeability, that once the wall of the ego is dissolved by the process of distillation through love, that instead of there being just some little opening where it goes, the entire membrane between life and death opens up. When the wall of the ego goes, it isn't just that the ego's wall is gone, because that was like some square, some tile that we were holding in front of our eyes, and when we take it away, we see that there was no wall anywhere else in the whole universe. That what we thought was a wall was some kind of stupid little thing that we were holding up before our eyes, and that's the only place it existed. And that when we took it away, it wasn't just that the square of the size of the ego's tile missing, but that the entire universe was hopelessly wide to love. And that the very tragedy that we were immersed in becomes immediately transformed into this, the old Pythagorean phrase was a super celestial glory. That instead of the road between life and death being so exotically, arcanely difficult to find, is so immensely easy that it's everywhere. That you couldn't have ever missed it except for the fact that you were forcing yourself to hold something in front of your eyes and saying it's no damn good. The only thing that's no damn good is holding that in front of your eyes. So when Rilke is writing, he says, "The place we rip open again and again, that always heals. That's God. We're all sharp-edged from our need to know. He is spread out, serene. Even the pure and blessed libations he takes into his world is just one way, by staying motionless, never controlling the way things turn out. Only the dead drink from that spring that we can hear when the God signals to them silently. Just the noise of it reaches us, and the lamb begs for its bell out of its quieter instinct." The sonnets to Orpheus are mysterious. They have an odd quality. I brought 6 different translations up here, and you can read through each of them, go through the German word by word, make your own translation, and still you don't have it. Because this is a kind of a language which is immanent. The words don't stick to things. They dissolve into wider ranges of freedom, of an interiorization where we begin to realize that on the level where symbols out of distillation come into being, the oceans of value are so immense that we're glad to have the little boats of ideas to be able to float on that ocean, and that we can navigate the whole oceans with those. Or to use the simile that Homer did, that words, when they go within, they gain wings. Soulful words are winged words. And they're like the birds that can fly in this interior world. And they don't need places to land on because they have wings and they can fly forever. It's this kind of quality that is brought out. Writing the following year to some friends, when Sonnets to Orpheus was published in 1923 in Leipzig, he wrote to a couple of friends. He said, these poems seem intended to be grasped as a whole through the inspiration of one who is like-minded rather than by what is called understanding. It's egotistical to seek to understand by symbols first. That's no way to treat a gift. That's what tyrants do. That's what demagogues do. They bludgeon things with those ideas, rather than see that they are winged vehicles for exploration. That's their nature. And that one goes there openly because of a like-mindedness, because of an affinity. One can understand the Sonnets to Orpheus truly later on, but only after an appreciation of being like-minded, because understanding is differential and like-minded is integrational, and integration always precedes differentiation. There is no differentiation without integration. And how you integrate plays back out how you will differentiate. And if you integrate an ocean that has no walls, your differentiation will be a cosmos without end. That's what salvation was. To every extent that you limit your integration, that you grasp and you nail it down, whatever you have nailed down will be an impairment in your differentiation. And if you want to be free in an infinite cosmos, one needs to go willingly into the silence of the soul and let it be the ocean that it is. He wrote, where a darkness remains, it is of a kind that requires not explanation, but inclination. And the inclination is for a kind of quality that we would call acceptance. The final stage of integration, we'll see in symbols, is acceptance. And then the gift that comes after that is absorption. We have a whole page of this in our pamphlet and our outline, and I think maybe here we'll just enter this in. Absorbing experience. It's page 29 of our course outline. The mythic horizon is concerned with absorbing experience. This absorption is done through activities and then images associated with those activities. For instance, a primal activity in the mythic horizon is ritual dance. The dance, especially its steps, its movement articulations, is one of the basic ritual comportments. Adjoining the dance movements in close association, relations are costume, makeup, ceremonial implements. The dance is the ritual per se, while the costumes pertain to ceremony, the ceremonial images. Dance denotes ritual, costume connotes ceremony, which would be a short form conception. Absorbing experience in the mythic horizon has a ritual and a ceremonial aspect, both carried over from the ritual or mask level. But the mythic horizon also adds language, so that singing or chanting completes the raising of ritual to myth. Silent dancing, even with costumes, would still be only ritual. But where language is just mere rote and not understood in a feeling-toned way, this instigates a regression from the mythic horizon back to a bastardized ritual. Such chants are without meaning, or to be more exact, without knowing meaning, and this creates bad magic spells that are formulated and are uttered and make a regressed existence. Ritual magic is therefore always a regression, not magic at all, having no radiance of symbolic consciousness, merely an imploded, distorted view. So there are attentive qualities of reality to the exploration that we're going to have the next 12 weeks with symbols. My major concern is that as we go into symbols and go deeper into it, that I withdraw myself from the focus more and more. Because anyone who remains at that focus, other than you, in your interior, would be a trigger for a regression without you even knowing it. And since I know that real well, use bad English to make it stick, I really know that good, I don't do it. So don't look for the understanding of symbols to come from me. It has to come from you. And as I disappear from this chair more and more, at the end of that, when we come to symbols having its interval, you'll notice that the work that we use is the cloud of unknowing. And one of the peculiar things of the cloud of unknowing is that not only is the cloud of unknowing above us, but when you get into it, it's also then below you. And being surrounded by the cloud of unknowing is exactly the right place to be at the end of symbols. If you suppose in egotistic projection that there's anything that you know at the end of symbols, to that extent your differentiation is going to be impaired. We need to specifically and exactly end with being comfortable at knowing that we don't know. It's a kind of a thing called Socratic ignorance. Because to know that we don't know gives us the right tone which allows for that rebound out of nowhere, which Rilke in the Sonnets to Orpheus gives us. Use Stephen Mitchell here. the 12th of the first part. Hail to the God who joins us, for through him arise the symbols where we truly live. And with tiny footsteps, the clocks move separately from our authentic time. Though we are unaware of our true status, our actions stem from pure relationship. Far away, antennas hear antennas, and the empty spaces transmit pure readiness. Oh, unheard starry music! Isn't your sound protected from all static by the ordinary business of our days? In spite of all the farmer's work and worry, he can't reach down to where the seed is slowly transmuting into summer. The earth bestows. Next week, let's look at Virginia Woolf. So get a copy of To the Lighthouse and just start in on it. And we'll go with Virginia. She's a great guide.